This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
I'm Jocelyn Dodd. I work at in the School of Museum Studies at Leicester University, and I run a research centre that sits within the school. So I'm going to talk about work that we've done around disability and particularly disability representation using museum collections, but sort of to give a lens for it really. And the title of this, Cabinet of Curiosities, comes from the project we finished last year, which resulted in a performance, which I'll show you a little bit of a clip of in a minute. So to give you some context for this, the research centre is, as I say, it nests within the School of Museum Studies, which is a postgraduate school. So essentially we run a master's programme for people who will work in museums. We have both campus-based and distance learning programmes. So we have lots of people who are working in museums who are doing that programme. And it's a very international course as well. So we have the most diverse student base in the university. With I don't know if it's this year or not, but certainly in past years we've had students from 25 different countries from every continent. So it's a very sort of global perspective really. The research centre was set up in 1999, and it was specifically set up as a result of a report that was commissioned by the Department of Media, Culture and Sport, which David Anderson, who is Head of Education at the Victoria and Albert Museum, did. So this report called A Commonwealth, one of the recommendations was that a research centre should be set up specifically around museum learning. But actually very quickly we changed the title of it, so it was broader than that, because a lot of the work that we do is around the social role of museums. So it's very much about the way in which people engage with museums and how we can support museums to be much more creative, and to think about that in relation to policy and practice. So, and we're absolutely driven by the values of being socially purposeful institutions. So it's very much about working with museums. My background is, I come from museum practice, so I was, the job before this, I was Director of Nottingham Museums, so it's very much from a practice-based approach, not an academic approach, so it's bringing those two elements together. So let's have a look, and I wanted to give you a bit of context for this, so to talk a little bit about disability, because actually none of this makes any sense without understanding the context of disability. And I don't know how how much it's part of your everyday experience. Any perspectives on that?
Apart from the students, but there's very few that. But I was at Kingston before I was at Holloway, and I met more disabled students there than I do at Holloway. But it's more spread out campus. So.
Yeah. And what?
Not particularly. Again, students and family members who are visually or hearing impaired. My dad's deaf in one ear, so I grew up with it. Of sort of knowing where you have to stand and how you have to speak.
So part, but not part in some ways, right? Yeah. Okay. I wanted to put this quote in from Jackie Gay, who's a writer, and Matt Fraser, who's the artist we worked with on this project. And they talk about the idea of disabled people throughout the world are engaged in a long, complicated struggle with the way in which they're portrayed and the meanings attached to their portrayals. These include disability as stigma, as a sign of a damaged soul, as well as being less than human, as dependent, weak, sexless and valueless. And I think it's really interesting that they are so present this very negative view, because they are the most alive, creative, charismatic, productive, loving people you can imagine. But I think what they're doing is giving a sense of how disability as a theme within society is something which often has little significance and little status. And in many ways, people have talked about disability as being the last great prejudice. So we're very familiar with the idea of thinking about racism as sexism and religious prejudice. But David Heavey, the filmmaker, who produced the very polemic BBC TV series The Disabled Century, talks about the idea of disability, people being really doggedly resistant to engaging with disability and disablism. And he believes it's based on this deep-rooted fear of disability, which cuts across all ages, genders, wealth, every aspect of society. And disability can happen to anybody at any time in their life. So there's that sense that it can also be incredibly diverse. It includes physical disability, mental health, people who have particular impairments, people who have a learning disability, impairments that people were born with, and those that they acquire during life. Can be the result of war and conflict or of accidents. So it's this incredibly complex and often interrelated aspects of people that may have multiple impairments as well. In the UK, 1 in 4 people are disabled. So we're not talking about a tiny proportion of society, we're talking about a quarter of society, which actually is massively significant, but something which, as a society, we don't really connect with. The think tank Demos, they developed a piece of work which coined this phrase, disablism, which they say you won't find this definition in the dictionary, but it's discriminatory, oppressive and abusive behaviour arising from the belief that disabled people are inferior to others. I think what's interesting about thinking about this is that disablism is manifest in many different ways. And I'm just thinking, when I came down on the train today, there was somebody using a wheelchair. And of course you have to have a designated space as a wheelchair user on the train. And of course we can put the man on the moon, but actually we can't have trains that have equality of access, you know, so you have to wait. She was waiting for somebody to, help her with the ramp to get off the train. And I know people that are left, in limbo like that, stuck. So, and of course that has to be planned, that has to be booked in advance, you can't do those things. So there are all those subtle elements to the experiences of disabled people. But there's also a much more insidious aspect to this, which is after the Paralympics and all the fantastic publicity there was and TV coverage, which was enormous, really enormous, that there was a rise in hate crime against disabled people. So whilst the stadium was full and the fullest and most, there were more people supporting that than any other Paralympic Games that had been, there was still this kind of attitude of people towards disabled people. So it's a kind of almost like a sort of schizophrenic approach to it, really. So let's unpick some of the values that sit behind this. Our ideas and responses to disability have really emerged over the centuries, and they affect every aspect of life. They're framed by things like religion, by medicine. And I wanted to look at this one photo, which is of George Priest, who was a miner, but his life changed in 1909. The photograph shows him with prosthetic legs. The legs normalise him, they allow him to stand, although he has no legs. But did they really give him mobility? What was his life like after his accident? What were the implications of being run over by a cauldron, of being carried home on a makeshift stretcher, of having to be taken from his home near Swansea by train to Cardiff, to the hospital there, where gangrene set in and he had his legs further amputated. The photograph epitomises the medical model of disability. So disability is the problem, and society wants you to look normal, acceptable to society. So what they did was create a normality by showing that he can still stand. In reality, George found walking incredibly difficult and used a wheelchair, which was because the prosthetic legs were so uncomfortable. He was only in his late 20s when he had this mining accident. He never worked after that. So his life was about learning new skills like tatting and doing things which he could do at home. But his life undoubtedly changed on a drastic scale. But what that epitomises, I think, is this medical model of disability. The medical model of disability sees the person's impairment as the problem. The focus is on fixing or curing the individual, normalising them. The medical model of disability views disability as a problem that belongs to the disabled individual. It's not of concern to anybody other than the person who's affected by it. And it's a very powerful model which has evolved through the development of medicine, and even today you'll still find clinicians who want to try to make somebody better and normalise them. And there have been some very challenging experiences that have happened to people as a result of that model, and some very positive things as well. This is a photograph by the artist Alison Lapper, who you might be familiar with. She was on the fourth plinth, Mark Quinn's sculpture of her, so outside in Trafalgar Square, outside the National Gallery, with to both critical artistic claim and but also to much discussion in the press about whether you should have a pregnant disabled woman alongside various other notable characters, really. But I think what this epitomises is that sort of a very different model from the medical model, because what Alison does is use the social model of disability, and you can see here she talks about her work reflects and responds to other people's attitudes to me. I hope to question and to change society's ideas about physical beauty, normality, disability and sexuality. As a disabled person, I'm generally perceived as being ugly, sexless, inert, helpless and miserable. I know I'm not. And I don't know if any of you have seen the series about children that were born in the year 2000, because Alison was one of the people that was involved in that, and her son Paris here. And when you see her life and her experiences with her son, you can see she has absolutely dynamic, exciting, but challenging as well. And she talks here about her work gives her the opportunity to present herself to the world in my own terms. And the hands that you can see there in the picture but not see the body are of her PA, who enables her to be able to to bring up a young child and to live as full a life as she can, really. So this fits in, the kind of life experiences Alison Lapper has are absolutely about the social model of disability, and this really stems from the disability arts movement, and you can see this quote comes from 1976 from the Union of Physically Impaired Against Segregation. So this was an American organisation that were focusing around the social model of disability, which in their view says society is society which disables people. Disability is something that's imposed on top of our impairments. By the way, we're unnecessarily isolated and excluded from full participation in society. And I think that's a really critical, really important part of this, to think about that social aspect of it. There's been a lot of work recently done by Tom Shakespeare, and he wrote a book called Disability Rights and Wrongs in 2006, where he suggests the social model ignores the actual experience of impairment, and he argues that not everything can be resolved by society. So he argues that you need a much more nuanced and complex view of disability. But what's very clear in both Tom Shakespeare's view and in the social model of disability is that disabled people are at the heart of that process. It's not something that's done to them, but with them, and with them as central drivers within that. So I want to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing, which explores some of these issues and tries to use museums and their collections to challenge society's views of disability and of disablism. I want to draw on the idea that this comes both from practice. The picture on the top left is of the Castle Museum in Nottingham, where I worked, and my colleague Richard Sandell. We've both been involved in this work. We both worked in Nottingham, both work now at Leicester University. But also from a series of research projects, action research projects, which are about trying to unpick some of those issues and to develop ideas within museum practice. And alongside those, what these projects do is look at 4 different areas, really. It looks at the idea of access, which so often is what frames people's thinking about disability. They think the first thing if you say to somebody about disability is it's always about wheelchairs. As if everybody that was disabled used a wheelchair. But actually it's much more about representation. How are disabled people represented? How are they part of the body of what, the resource that you have? And within museums, that's within museum collections. For us, it's also been about political engagement. It's about saying you can use museums in a very specific way. You can use and reconceptualise those collections, rethink those collections in a way which can be used in a very socially purposeful way. But critical to this is participation of course, of disabled people, but of engaging audiences as well and users to reframe those discussions and to think very differently. So that journey began for me in the mid-1990s, and it began with access, absolutely, as I was saying. When people talk about disability, they think about access. The Castle Museum is on the site of a medieval castle, so it's a Grade 1 listed building on the site of a scheduled ancient monument, so it has all those challenges of being great space for a medieval castle, great view out, very difficult to get to, and the building itself was almost completely inaccessible. So we produced these access guides that actually in retrospect were hysterical because they were so difficult. Anybody that could access that building through this circuitous route, and then you get to a certain point and there'd be a flight of stairs, but you can't see upstairs because there's no lift, you can't do that. And you have to go through that door, and then you've got to go round here, and then you've got to go through, it's just ridiculous. And there were no accessible toilets, you wouldn't get upstairs to the main galleries. We got lottery funding to redevelop the building, and as part of that process we set up, and it was really our first attempt to fully involve disabled people, we set up a disability consultative group, which was really a real fundamental shift towards what I describe as participatory practice. We paid all the members of it. The chair selected the other members, so we recruited the chair, she selected other people. We did it on the basis of having a range of people's experiences, not on the range of impairments. So we weren't trying to look for every impairment which we knew was impossible to achieve, but for instance, some disabled people who were very politicised about their disability, some who were much less so, people who had very different experiences. And myself and my colleague Richard Sandell both worked with them, but also we didn't act as mediators because we wanted all the museum staff to be part of this, because we wanted to challenge the practice across the whole organisation. That was really critical structural thing within it. But one of the things that emerged very, very quickly from this was, okay, once we've got access to this, what are we going to see? If I had a mirror, where will I see myself? Where's my history? Where's my experience? And this really helped us to challenge curators to think about their collections in new ways and to actually investigate their collections in new ways. And Neil Walker, who was then the keeper of art, looked at the painting collections, the material, and he came and he said, this engraving has been in the collection, has never been displayed. It's a self-portrait by Sarah Biffin. You can see she's got a paintbrush strapped to her shortened arm, and she was a very accomplished miniaturist. But why had it never been exhibited? Why was it never displayed? And this set us out on a journey of investigating museum collections. We got Research Council funding from what was then the AHRB, so it's the Arts and Humanities Research Board. It wasn't a council then. But we got innovation money for a project called Buried in the Footnotes, and we wanted to investigate the invisibility and the absence of disability, and to find out, was it that there wasn't material in collections, or was it that it wasn't being exhibited? So we recruited two researchers who were both disabled, and we had a team of us working on this, and we surveyed over 100 museums and then did in-depth case studies. We interrogated the documentation in the collections, and we had some quite uncomfortable discussions with curators where we made them look at words like, search for words like cripple, lunatic, invalid, words which were absolutely out of, seen as not being appropriate today, really. But what this came up with is... No, that's okay, it's nice to see you. No, that's okay. What this did was to develop an incredible, fruitful amount of material, and what we found was that there were collections across all the museums that we looked at. So there were military material, there was ethnographic material, there was social history, it was across the board. Every kind of institution that we looked at, there was material there. So in this photo you can see on the left a wheelchair that belonged to Eva Luca, who was the matron of the Royal London Hospital Museum. So she wasn't somebody who was in the hospital, but she was running the hospital, and it sort of locates it in a very different way, really.
When was she running?
In the late 19th century. And in the middle, another Mark Quinn is part of the series that he did with Alison Lapper. And then on the right-hand side, so that was the contemporary art, and then on the right-hand side, this is a costume from Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery of Richard Stratton, who I'll tell a little bit more about later. So a vast array of material, including things like this prosthetic arm with a range of different fittings, and the reality was that it was the hook that was the most useful of those fittings. So the one that is most acceptable to society is the one with the hand on, but the one that is most useful is the hook, because you can do more with it. It's a much more useful tool to have. So Richard Stratton, which you saw his costume, this is a card of him and his wife. He was also known as General Tom Thumb, displayed himself in the freak show, a highly lucrative career, but it poses very challenging questions about society in the 19th century and the macabre public interest in physical appearance. And that whole notion of staring is really interesting, because museums are places where people are encouraged to stare. But there's this big question here about the freak show and staring. What do you do with this material? How do you present it? And what became very obvious very quickly was that curators didn't know how to use the material. They didn't know how to interpret it. They were anxious about it. There were also things like this, which was a hand-painted magic lantern from Birmingham Museum of drunken sailors. And what I think is interesting about this is it fits in a bit like the double amputee that I showed you earlier. There were many things that related to specific industrial accidents. So, sailing resulted in many people losing their legs. So you'll see lots of images like this. But there were also this was a bust of Lord Nelson at the National Maritime Museum. It's interesting that the researcher was told by the curator that Nelson wasn't disabled, he was a hero. And I think that begins to give you a sense of that response that people have and how they understand disability, how it's perceived, how it's seen, how it's valued. By contrast to Nelson, but also associated with the sea, is this photograph of Robert Dryden, this is from Whitby Museum, and he was photographed by the very accomplished local photographer Frank Meadows Sutcliffe, who documented Whitby in minutiae of details. It's a fantastic, amazing collection of photos. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but it's a real insight into the everyday life of a town. But in the midst of those was this photo of Robert Stumper Dryden. So his nickname was Stumper, and he was photographed like everyone else and absolutely part of the everyday life of a 19th century fishing community. And we found one of his relatives so there was still knowledge of him and experience, so we were able to work with local community to reinterpret that image. But there were also, probably the most nuanced and most sensitive interpretation was around Joseph Merrick. This is at the Royal London Hospital Museum. And this, I think the curator there had really got behind the elephant man to the real man of Joseph Merrick. And this is within the context of that museum still holding on to his skeleton despite his explicit wishes that he should have been buried. And what he got to was the sense of the humanity of the person rather than the freakery. And if you look at the display there, you can't see the big freak, but actually what you see is all the things about his life. So you get a sense much more of the individual and a sense of his values, and so much more about him. But the material also raised some what we described as interpretive dilemmas. The image on the left here is of Harnack, who was one of the X-ray martyrs, who you can see the effect of X-rays on his hands. And there are a huge number of photographs, particularly in medical museum collections, of people who have various medical conditions, many of which are very disturbing. So, for instance, there'll be lots of images of people with huge cancerous tumours, for instance, extending on a vast scale. So it's, I think there are massive ethical issues about how do you present that material. On the right hand side you can see a painting which is sort of quite naive painting, and you might think, what's that got to do with disability? And that's one of the other issues that emerged from this project, was that there was lots of material that related to the lives of disabled people, but it was not obvious. And this is a painting by John Vine. It's in the Colchester Museum collection, and he was an accomplished watercolourist who was disabled, but you would have no inkling from the painting that was the case. And there are some disabled people who choose not to present themselves as disabled in their lifetime, and the dilemma is, do you do that after the event? So many curators were very anxious about how they could exhibit that material. They didn't want to cause offence, they wanted to do it effectively. So we developed an action research project. It was quite substantial. It was £500,000 project working with 9 museums over a 2.5-year period. And it was called Rethinking Disability Representation, which culminated in this publication. And what we wanted to do was to support museums to be able to work together to experiment in how they might begin to present material around disability, but also to challenge visitors in their thinking about disability as well. So how could they challenge and get visitors to think differently about disability? And they were all interpretive interventions. Most of them were temporary exhibitions, some of them were integrated into displays, and there was one learning project. And the museums varied, and we purposefully did this. So we had, the biggest museum was the Imperial War Museum, and the smallest was Whitby Museum. So you had the Imperial War Museum, big national museum, and then you've got volunteer-run institution, where the first thing the curator said was, honorary curator said, we don't do meetings. That's the first point. So it sort of gave you a sort of, a sense of, okay, we can see how this is going to work. But what that project did was bring people together to be able to think collectively about an issue. We also had a think tank of disabled people who were part of it, and we used a trading zones model where the lived experiences of disabled people had as much value as anybody else's experiences. And they resulted in a variety of things, and this is from relates to the Joseph Merrick material. This is a film that was produced by David Heavey, and it's a really haunting film. It's on our website, so do have a look at it. It's now become part of a trilogy, and what it does is unpick what the idea of Joseph Merrick and his experiences, what the impact of that has been for disabled people. So you can see Jonathan on the bottom left-hand side, who's the curator, who's incredibly knowledgeable about all the material that they have related to Merrick. But what this does is get disabled people to talk about the impact that Merrick has had, where about the way one of the participants, you can see, who's got a copy of Joseph Merrick's Hood, talks about the idea of hiding away because you're public, because people stare at you all the time, because you are public property where people can just feel as if it's okay to do anything. Nothing knows any bounds, really. The film was narrated by the daughter of Rowena, who's on the top left of this, and you can just see her daughter holding a calling card. Unfortunately, Rowena died, but her daughter gives, I think, a very it's a very disarming way of engaging people in what is a very uncomfortable film for people who are not disabled. So it really gets to you. It's really worth watching because it is, no, seriously, because it challenges your perceptions of what disability is. So I think it's, and it was used, it's still used in the museum as one of a menu of films. The museum is tiny, very, very small space, so it's a way in which you can get over quite complicated ideas in a small space. The Imperial War Museum hadn't had any experience of doing work around disability representation before, but they absolutely embraced this project totally, so really interesting to work with. And they interrogated their collections with great zest and came up with the most amazing, I mean, they have got the most amazing collections. And this is an example, First World War veterans, double and triple amputees. And they developed a series of programmes, and one of them, this was used for a programme called Welcome Home, and looked at society's attitudes to people returning, disabled men returning after the First World War, and the impact that had. And there's a poster that the YMCA produced, which you may have seen, which says, "Don't pity the disabled man, give him a job." And you think, that's from the late, 100 years ago, and I wonder how much things have moved on sometimes. Sometimes it doesn't feel as if it's moved on that much. I went to see the new redeveloped First World War galleries and was really pleased to see that they now have a small but permanent part of that gallery relates to disabled veterans, and I think that feels like a small, push in a door, really, of engaging with that. In Tyne and Wear at Discovery Museum, they produced an exhibition called 1 in 4, because 1 in 4 people in the North East are disabled, and that was a temporary exhibition which challenged people's ideas of disability and used a whole variety of ways of doing it. In the same way that Colchester Museum, they did a temporary exhibition called Life Beyond the Label, and they actively collected, but they also used creative processes as well. And on the right is what Sophie Weaver, who was their then access officer, and it took me a while to recognise her because she normally wears glasses and has long hair, and they'd written, as you can see across here, about identity using lipstick. So this is just lipstick on her face, but I think it's so you can see her saying she's sarcastic, she's a writer, she's a sister, she's an actress, she's flirty, she's attractive, she's funny, she's human, but she's also disabled. But actually how most people would see her would be as being disabled. So it raised all sorts of questions about how people perceive things. But it also actively collected for the exhibition to add to their collection. So they got things like the door of a padded cell, for instance. They got this an amazing piece of archive film by a clinician who had pioneered care in the community, so people who had been institutionalised for sort of 20, 30 years, and seeing these people living at the seaside in Essex, having had no freedom whatsoever, and just having the freedom to be able to eat food they wanted, to be able to do things in their time as they wanted, was enormous, absolutely enormous. So some really interesting material. We worked with Birmingham Museum as well, and they produced interventions with their painting collections. So it was called Talking About Disability and Art. So it was using their existing galleries, but just putting stands in that had recordings of a curator talking about a painting and a disabled person talking about one. And this is a Pre-Raphaelite painting by William Holman Hunt, The Finding of the Saviour in the Temple. It's incredibly, like many Pre-Raphaelite paintings, incredibly vivid, intense. It's a biblical scene featuring a number of visibly disabled people. So you get this sort of art historical view of it from the curator, who locates it, within the biblical context, but also within the art historical context of the Pre-Raphaelites. And then you get Paul Dark, an academic and broadcaster who's disabled, giving a blistering analysis of the impact of religion and the notion of cure and miracles and pity, and how that frames how many people think about disabled people. So what it's doing is challenging the perceptions. And it's interesting, my colleague Richard showed this in the States, and he got the frostiest response from it, because it's very much more religious society, who are very uncomfortable with that being challenged by somebody who's saying, well, actually I feel very uncomfortable with the way in which Christianity frames me as a disabled person. So some quite controversial elements, but what we wanted to do with that project was to actively find out whether the interventions had challenged people's views, and that's what we were trying to do. So we had a response card which we used across each of the interventions. So we had the same question across all the museums, and we wanted to try to get people's responses to it. So we invited them to either write or to draw responses to this. We've used this method a lot and had very rich data from it. But we did an in-depth analysis using NVivo. So we had at one stage we had over 100 different categories that emerged from it. It was a bit of a nightmare trying to whittle it down. So it was a real in-depth analysis of the whole thing. There were some people that struggled with the language, so you could see that they didn't know how to use language in relation to disability, or weren't sure of what terms to use. There were some people, a very small minority, who hated the idea of having exhibitions that had anything to do with disability. So we had one person that went to Colchester who said, I came to Colchester Museum to find out about the Normans. So why am I being inflicted with all this stuff? But actually, most responses were incredibly positive. But this one for me was visually the strongest, but also I think gave the sense of what the project was trying to do. So you can see, at last I'm here in the centre, not here on the periphery. So, a disabled person who feels their rightful place, really, who sees themselves at the centre of that and not somewhere else. What we were aware of with rethinking disability representation was that it was very much framed by a social model of disability, that there's always this tension with a medical model. So we decided in the end that probably we ought to go into the territory of what was perhaps the most challenging area within museums, which is to work with medical museum collections. So we developed a project called Stories of a Different Kind, which would challenge us to think more about that medicalised view, and think of how you can use that material and how you can use it with to present a much more politicised view of disability, but also to have a wider conversation. So we got Wellcome Trust funding for this and worked with Matt Fraser, who's an actor and performer and musician, and does all sorts of things. Takes his clothes off quite a lot as well. So he's a very interesting character to work with. We worked with 3 museum collections: the Science Museum, the Royal College of Surgeons and the Royal College of Physicians. And what we were absolutely wanting to raise a debate and discussion in society about disability. And I love this. this photograph. This is of Matt in front of the great and the good. You know, this is the surgeons, nearly all men, nearly all white, you know, all in suits. It's absolutely about the establishment. And what Matt is the least establishment figure you can imagine. So it's, you know, it's how can you begin to unpick those collections? And these are some of the most challenging collections because they are, as you can see here, the Hunterian Museum, they are body parts, they're skeletons, they are examples of, you know, all sorts of really difficult material. And places like the Science Museum have got the most cavernous collections and stores full of hundreds and hundreds of examples of prosthetic legs and, you know, of all sorts of aspects of medical history. So we brought people together in what we described as an exchange, so an exchange of ideas, so disabled people, curators, medical historians, and the research centre framed it, and we had somebody from the Smithsonian as well. And Matt worked with curators to investigate the collections and interrogate the collections, to think about those collections in new ways. And there's a series of quite amusing photos as well. Matt is very keen in terms of how you can engage people as well and have those wider debates. But we were very conscious that those issues around how disability is viewed is still absolutely in the press, and it remains the forefront really of those issues. So the project culminated in a performance that Matt produced, which was partly a lecture, partly a rap. It was about unpicking stories, it was framed by collections, it was about engaging the public. It was a performance, and then we had post-show discussions. So we had people like Lynn Gardner from The Guardian speaking, and, you know, a variety of other people to unpick and tease out the issues that were emerging. One of the objects was from the Science Museum, and it was a brace that was used with a young child. And I want to show you a little bit of a clip of the performance that Matt did, which I hope will illustrate some of the...
The clip we're about to see is early footage of Terry Wiles. I want you to... You're going to see some footage, and then halfway through his personal testimony is going to come in, because it's a really good example of how a hidden history can expand the subject. I thank Professor Anne Balsa and Dr. Ruth Blue for this possibility as I access the film through them, although the particular audio clip I got by interviewing Terry on Skype in New Zealand 3 weeks ago. Anyway, let's roll the film.
It was really weird. I mean, because what I can remember is when I was on the legs, I was like hanging in midair, and so that's a really disorientating feeling for a kid, you know. It's really scary. And then I had these arms on as well, and they were like really heavy, so I felt like, whoa! I felt really unwieldy and really, really, really unsafe, and I felt like my personality and my whole thing had been changed by these arms and legs. I felt like, why am I wearing these? These, you know, even as a kid, I could put them into words, but I was thinking, why am I wearing these? It's a shit. It's crazy. Why do I have to wear them? Yeah, it was stupid and dangerous. I mean, I could have fallen over and lost my other eye, you know. But I hated wearing them. But nobody listened. It was kind of like I was an invisible person. Like I would say, I don't want to do this, quite loudly, and nobody would listen. You know, oh no, dear, it's good for you, you know, it'll help you. It's like, it's not helping me. And all these boffins, you know, around me, they had no idea. Yeah, it was stupid.
Now for me, that bit of footage kind of personifies this entire evening, because we're trying to illustrate how an experience of a medicalised image of a disabled person can be revolutionarily changed and expanded when you approach it from a social perspective, and a description of what it felt like emotionally from the person is that. And I think you'll agree with me, it changes the footage a little bit. You watch it once, you watch it a second time hearing the testimony, and it's just hugely different. And that's what this show is all about, really. I mean, that is that.
It's I think that clip probably illustrates the project more than anything else, and I think Terry Wiles, even as a young child, you can see how he could understand that actually it was just ridiculous, and his adoptive father made him a very early electric wheelchair, which gave him mobility, you know, and the difference between those two things are just incredible. But that was part of the thalidomide story, really, which society was very concerned to deal with, I guess. But we also wanted to get a sense of, did this have any impact? Well, what Matt was trying to do was to, as he says here, I want people to leave with a more informed, equitable and respectful way of understanding disabled people, each other, all of us, society. And so it's not just about disabled people, it's about everybody. And just a couple of quotes to give you a sense. We had some medical students who were part of the audience, and we're beginning to do some work with trainee medical students as well, and feel that that's an enormously important part of trying to challenge the perception of the way in which medicine has had very particular views of disability. And I think one of the elements you can see here is based on research and evidence, but it's that it was balanced with humour, and parts of it were very funny, very, very funny, as in many ways this photograph is of Matt, but actually it's funny, but it's also incredibly sad, because there were some people have had parts of their limbs cut off to accommodate prosthetic limbs, so they have even less mobility than they would have had. The performance was really engaging, it was energetic, it was thought-provoking, and I think this photo shows the futility of much that's been done in the name of medicine and normality. The performance was done as a keynote performance at the Museums Association conference in Cardiff last year, and it had a standing ovation, which we were absolutely delighted with. And it was also the winner of the Observer Ethical Award for Art and Culture. And I think it is that kind of profile that begins to give a sense that museums and some of the issues they're raising can be of more significance than just the preoccupation of other museums. We've just started on another project, which is on a larger scale, called Exceptionally Extraordinary, which we're in the middle of doing. This is also Wellcome funded, and we're working with 4 artists this time, which look at that idea that since humans first appeared on Earth, no two have been the same, yet somewhere along the way, certain bodies and minds have been more highly valued than others, and some have been viewed as problematic, deviant, unruly, deficient, requiring adjustment towards a perceived idealised norm. And how much that is part of society today, hugely. So we're just embarking on that project, which will culminate in a variety of performances in June next year. We're working with 8 museums this year. But I think what this work has done for us is to see how museums can be used in a socially purposeful way to challenge society and to raise those debates beyond museums. And that's my address.